Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for all attending today. In our little pre-session meeting, we were talking about the difficulty of having to follow up 5 very experienced administrators. So we'll try and live up to their prestige. My name is Jalen Bate, and I'm hosting the session today, the panel discussion, and I'm very excited to be joined by 4 colleagues who I admire independently, and I'm really excited just to have a chat with them, and hopefully we say something that piques your interest or you find useful in your own journeys. So as I said, my name is Jalen Bate. I'm currently the founder and artistic director of Symphony 21, which is an orchestra in Vancouver. We started in 2019, which was absolutely terrible timing. So pro tip, don't start an orchestra before a global pandemic. But here we are, we've been surviving, and luckily I think that's why I'm lucky enough to be a part of this panel. Symphony 21 is a professional orchestra that plays a variety of concerts throughout the Lower Mainland and Vancouver area. We focus on different programming mandates, and each of our concerts tries to address the fundamental question of getting new audiences to attend the orchestral experience through breaking down barriers in a variety of ways, whether that's venue, programming, or just finding ways to be more involved in the community. I am also the director of the Vancouver Brass Collective, which is a brass ensemble in Vancouver employing young professionals for a variety of projects. Both of my ensembles are very involved in recording as a response to the pandemic and are now just transitioning back to live performance. A big part of what we try and do is consider who we're hiring, but always committing to hiring at a professional rate to create an offset of the community. So obviously Vancouver is a very diverse and urban city, but there's always musicians that are looking for work and looking to be a part of a community, and Symphony 21 was very much started to serve that purpose, to create a professional community that people play with on a regular basis, are paid professionally, and have something to do when the VSO isn't calling. So that is a little bit about me, and I think we're just going to go down the table and let these fine people introduce themselves as well.
Thanks, Jalen. My name is Sean Brody. I'm the artistic director and founder of the Queer Songbook Orchestra, which is a Toronto-based and now nonprofit organization. It began in 2014 as a 12, 13-piece chamber pop ensemble, and the idea behind it was always to sort of explore and express queer experience through sort of pop music of the last century or so that's being rearranged and reinterpreted for a chamber pop ensemble, chamber orchestra, strings and brass and winds and rhythm section and singers. And the organization has gone on now to establish the Queer Songbook Youth Orchestra, which is a year old now. So we've kind of gotten more into the world of mentorship and training with younger musicians. As young as 10 years old to about 23 is the range that we've been working with over the past year. And the idea behind that was to sort of provide a space for students to have another avenue to further their musical training, but also to sort of actively engage in the representation of a marginalized community, and to have a space where they could really be themselves and feel comfortable with in the sort of space and community that we've sort of formed around the group. And we've also over the pandemic developed programming for elementary schools, and we've recently partnered with the Toronto District School Board to go into schools and present programming for them to sort of try to inspire inclusivity and acceptance for younger students and a sort of broader understanding of queer and trans experience to younger age groups. So that's what the QSO does broadly, and I'm really happy to be here chatting with everyone here. So thanks. Is that one working?
I don't know. We'll check it out.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Fantastic. Hello, everybody. My name is Chelsea Hebert, and I am the network lead of the newly formed Sistema Canada Network. We are an art service organization that has been established to support, enrich, and accelerate the work of Sistema programs across the country. And we are very fresh. Our members first signed on in February 2022, and I just joined as the first staff member, part-time in October of this year, and full-time in January. So it's really great to be here with you and to chat with like-minded individuals. So happy to talk more.
Hello, everyone. Nice being here. My name is Jean-Frédéric Caron. I'm from Orchestre de l'Agora in Montreal, Canada. I'll do my opening remark in English, but I'll switch to French for the rest of the panel. So we're an orchestra that was founded on the idea of being a social orchestra. So we were founded in 2012 by our artistic director and conductor, Nicolas Ellis. On the idea of, well, first of all, there was a big and huge student strike in 2012 in Montreal for like 6 months. And that's when we had the first concert at Orchestre de l'Agora. And the next year, officially, the orchestra was founded on making concerts and giving proceeds back to community and charity organizations. And that idea kind of stayed throughout those last 9 years of activities that we've done. It kind of switched also to putting the musicians in the center of what we do, like including them in the process of the project we're doing. For example, we have a series of concert workshops that we do in the Bordeaux prison, north of Montreal. So we play each month, chamber music groups play in front of 60 inmates. That's part of what we do, but we also do a huge benefit concert called Gala de la Terre, each 2 years where we raise money for environmental organizations. And we did one last June where we played Mahler Third at the Maison Symphonique with Marie-Nicole Lemieux, and we raised $255,000 for UNICEF Canada and environmental organizations. So that's the type of stuff that we do at Orchestre de l'Agora, including many other things, but I'm happy to be here on this panel. Okay.
We have an abundance of mics at this table for this session. Hello, everyone. My name is Jana Saylor, and I'm the founder and artistic director of the Allegra Chamber Orchestra, which is an all-female identifying orchestra with a social action mandate. We founded in 2016, and we have chapters in both Vancouver and a newly formed chapter in Calgary. We have several smaller ensembles and programming initiatives that are under that umbrella of the organization, including a composer incubator and our recently formed Indigidivas, which is an ensemble of 4 Indigenous opera singers, and that is part of our Indigenous stream of programming. As mentioned, we have a social action mandate, so everything that we do is affiliated with a community partner, a charitable organization in our community, and we feel very strongly that we can use music as a powerful tool to create the change in the community that we would like to live in and participate in. And as part of our work, we have assisted with the founding of a music therapy program on Vancouver's downtown east side at a women's shelter, and we raised the seed funds for 1 year of a pilot project for that organization, and I'm happy to say that it is still up and running. We are all professional and all paid in accordance with union regulations, but a portion of our ticket sales is skimmed off and given to our charitable partners, and we've aligned with a number of different causes and organizations over the years. And we primarily perform the works of female identifying and minority artists to work towards more equity on our stages. Thank you.
Okay, so just a little bit about how we thought we structured this panel. As I said, we really want to make this a conversation between the 5 of us, but we also want to make it very open for you to ask any questions that you want and really interact, because I think all of our what we do and our ideas are very interesting. We'll choose interesting as a word. You know, that they're new and they're out there, and people always have questions for me, and I always have questions for the four of you about why we did this and what we're doing and how we make it work. So after each broad topic, we'll provide a pause for questions and answers rather than just at the end. And if it becomes an organic conversation between us and the audience, then I think that's fine with us. So just to frame our first topic of why should one do something new. So at this conference and in general, I think we all sit around our administrative tables, and a large part of our time is taken up with how difficult orchestras are, getting them off the ground, sustaining them, financial concerns, changing ideas around programming. So why the heck would you start something new and put yourself through that when you know full well what you're getting into? I think a lot about this question because I think all of us at this panel have days where we ask ourselves, why did we do this to ourselves? And my broad thought is I consider the orchestral family, the orchestral community in Canada as a family, in the sense that we have organizations that are over 100 years old, and I think we all were started within 10 years. Did you say 2013? 2014?
2014, but 2012, I think, right?
2013 officially.
Okay.
Not long. It's not a long time. 10 years at the max, essentially. So how do you balance the idea of a 10-year-old organization or a 4-year-old or a 2-year-old organization to something that's 100 years old? And how can you possibly be a part of that market? How do you get involved? How do you complement a program in a city rather than competing with it? And my answer is to think of it like a family, in the sense that in any family unit, you'll have elders, you'll have middle-aged members or parents, and then you have kids. And each component is important to one another. It's important to think about in a family the health of all those elements, but also considering what each stage in that life cycle can contribute. Obviously, elders can contribute wisdom and experience and history and tradition, but the new kids on the block, if you will, may come to the table with new ideas and ways to mix things up, and maybe an ear to the ground to different communities, because we all kind of sprung up from different communities. So of course there's many pros and cons to the approach of starting a new orchestra, especially in this day and age. And some of the topics we'll talk about are just, like I mentioned, not competing but complementing in a city. And filling a niche. I really appreciated a topic in the last panel talking about being in the community and not just stopping at a single new work, or not just stopping at having one diverse person in the orchestra, but really going into the community. I'll tell you a story about my experiences and where I'm leading Symphony 21 into the future. I'm Indo-Canadian. My dad was an immigrant from India in the 1970s. And growing up in classical music, there are statistics, especially put out by European orchestras, that Indo-Canadians are one of the most underrepresented groups in classical music. So when I went to music school and growing up through that was a community that I really wanted to reach out to. But even as an Indo-Canadian myself, I found that even I couldn't break that barrier, because there's no entry point. There's no starting conversation, because it's just something so different. On my way to work with NACO in February at the airport security in Vancouver, one of the security guards was making conversation, and it turns out that he runs Indian Performing Arts Festival in Surrey, BC in the summer. He gave me his card, and in talking about that connection, we've been talking for many months now about how we can connect with a different community. And that's really at the heart of what Symphony 21 does, is finding different ways to connect with different communities. Every concert that we do is focused on finding a different community that's not necessarily based on all the time race, gender, socioeconomic. It can also just be about artistic, that there's a whole community of Indo-Canadian artists that don't have an in to the orchestral setting, so we want to be able to provide that. Of course, we do provide mandates for ensuring that our programming reflects our community, but every single concert that we do is trying to connect with a different community and build off of that. In creating a new community, I often think about not competing with one that's already there. And I think one thing with new orchestras and new initiatives is always finding a way to speak with the people that are already there doing something, speaking with the elders in the family, and not necessarily being in competition with them. I think sometimes, especially, it can be misunderstood when a new orchestra pops up and starts, you know, the first time that we've booked a player that can't play with an elder organization, there can be this slight tinge of tension, and I think it's important for both sides of the coin to recognize that it is a family and that communication is important. And when you're starting something new, it provides so many opportunities to fill niches, to be complementary, to run parallel to what's happening in your environment. And I think listening to my other four colleagues talk about why they're doing something, which I think will be the next topic that I'll punt down the line, the why is just as important as the how, and I think that's a starting point for starting anything new. So I think I'll pass it to Jana, because you also started something out of a very socially mandated orchestra, but please, anyone who wants to jump in, feel free to do so.
Certainly. Well, I think in answer to the question, why should we do something new, it was in response to a need in our community amongst female identifying musicians to create a safe space where they could just be musicians and create. And back in 2016, you may recall, was the height of the Me Too movement, and we are in the midst of our day of reckoning in the classical music field, where historically things that have been going on, that gender-based and minority aggressions and things in the workplace that are finally being called out as unacceptable. And we really wanted to create a space where we could just lay that aside and just create, and also champion those that were in our community that were worthy of taking the stage, but were for reasons of perhaps gender and race, were perhaps not seeing the same opportunities. And so I guess something that now as a guest conductor working with more mainstream orchestras that have historically observed the perhaps a traditional generations of concert goers. Now part of my work is consulting with them and helping them to get to this place of more equity and diversity, and helping them to create a more safe and equitable workspace. But one advantage of us starting something new was that we started from that place. We started from a place of creating equity and being like, this is our mandate, this is what needs to be done, this is what we see needs to happen in our little community, our little corner of the world. And in that we are able to, we're quite nimble and able to adapt and create our policy in keeping with the needs that we see in our community and the changing demographics, which is an advantage of a smaller organization. Of course, we don't have the huge budgets and capacity of some of the more historical organizations, but that is something that we are very grassroots. We're more decentralized. We've purposely moved a lot of our performances away from the downtown core, and so that we are more, integrated into the downtown east side, and we're actually playing to the communities that we're playing their music. So that's been some of our strategies. It's as with anything, especially these days, it's a big experiment, but we feel that coming from that place of equity is a good place to start.
Oui, je rejoins beaucoup ce que Jalen a dit pour être complémentaire et non en compétition dans le milieu dans lequel on évolue, parce qu'à Montréal, il y a déjà évidemment des orchestres qu'on respecte beaucoup, qui sont fantastiques, principalement donc l'Orchestre symphonique de Montréal, l'Orchestre métropolitain. Donc pourquoi est-ce que faire un autre orchestre comme l'Orchestre de la Gare était pertinent notre communauté, ça a été un peu l'idée de base et comme l'impulsion de base que Nicolas Ellis a pensé de faire des concerts qui soutenaient des causes. Mais l'idée d'être collaboratif avec notre milieu, c'est comme rester très, très présent dans tout ce qu'on fait. Par exemple, au début de la pandémie, on a été un peu le jeune orchestre un peu fou qui a réouvert la Maison symphonique à Montréal et qui a créé, en fait pas a créé, mais a été les premiers à mettre en place toutes les nouvelles mesures sanitaires après la COVID pour faire un programme symphonique. Et on a ouvert ce qui était au Québec permis d'avoir, on a pu avoir 50 personnes dans les salles de concert et on a invité dans le fond des médecins et des infirmiers, infirmières et des travailleurs de la santé à comme venir profiter d'un concert de musique classique et à soutenir une cause justement qui venait en aide aux patients atteints de la COVID. Ça, c'était en juillet 2020. Mais pour ce programme-là, Nicolas Ellis avait été, en fait, a invité le violon solo de l'Orchestre symphonique de Montréal et la violon solo de l'Orchestre métropolitain pour jouer ensemble. Elle joue aussi de l'alto, mais pour jouer ensemble la symphonie concertante de Mozart. Donc ça, c'était comme un peu un exemple de prendre notre place dans notre communauté, mais aussi laisser briller le talent des autres orchestres à Montréal. Un autre exemple aussi de programmation qu'on fait, en fait, à l'Orchestre de l'Agora, on est maintenant l'orchestre en résidence de l'Atelier lyrique de l'Opéra de Montréal. Donc chaque année, on bâtit l'Atelier lyrique de l'Opéra de Montréal. En fait, c'est un programme qui accueille 10 chanteurs d'opéra après leurs études et avant le monde professionnel. Et ça leur permet de se perfectionner. Et ils n'avaient pas en fait d'orchestre avec qui ils collaboraient régulièrement. Ils font partie en fait de l'entité de l'Opéra de Montréal qui collabore déjà avec les orchestres que je viens de nommer. Mais leur groupe Atelier lyrique de jeunes chanteurs n'avait pas d'orchestre en résidence. Donc, l'orchestre, on est un peu venu complémenter finalement le programme de l'Atelier lyrique. Donc, on essaie de justement s'inscrire un peu dans ce qui se fait. Puis jusqu'ici, ça a fonctionné. Donc, c'est un peu l'idée aussi de faire des concerts en prison. Il y a... Je dirais, évidemment, d'autres orchestres ont des projets comme ça de faire de la musique devant des communautés plus marginalisées. Mais je crois pas qu'il y ait un orchestre qui fait vraiment chaque mois, en fait, de la musique de chambre devant des détenus. Puis ce projet-là, je trouve que ça représente aussi beaucoup ce que l'Orchestre de l'Agora en fait. Évidemment, je suis directeur général, mais on a une petite équipe à temps partiel, mais on engage aussi beaucoup nos musiciens dans les projets qu'on fait. Thomas Beard, qui est ici, c'est notre violoncelle solo, mais c'est aussi lui qui fait la programmation de tous les concerts qu'on fait à la prison de Bordeaux. Puis on a un peu cet esprit-là dans tout ce qu'on fait. Nos 12 musiciens permanents sont aussi eux-mêmes engagés dans les projets qu'on fait. Puis c'est ce qui fait que ça donne un peu une pertinence peut-être plus à nos projets. Par exemple, notre violon solo est aussi la vice-présidente de notre conseil d'administration. Donc, bref, je pourrais parler longtemps sur tout ça, mais c'est un peu notre façon d'être pertinent dans notre communauté parce que Montréal, c'est un beau problème d'avoir autant d'orchestres et autant d'offres musicales. Mais on essaie de s'inscrire dans tout ça de façon complémentaire. Donc, voilà.
Maybe just I'll jump in and frame a different part of our conversation for Chelsea and Sean, just so that we stay on track, because it's amazing how time flies when we're talking about new ideas. The one thing that I experienced with Symphony 21 and starting small organizations and even talking to major orchestras that may start something new or a new initiative is what year 1 versus year 5 looks like. So for our first concert, we had 4 newspaper articles and radio spots and this whole thing, and the first concert was great, and we had lots of people. Second concert, nothing. Nobody cared, you know? And I think, you know, the symptom of the asset of being new is being new itself, that it's something that people are interested in. And, you know, once you are out of the gate, it's welcome to the real world. And how do you maintain interest? How do you sustain yourself? What does year 1 versus year 5, 10, 15, 20 look like in your organization? And then beyond that, you know, obviously there's the creation element, but once you're going, what does planning for the long term look like? The first panel again talked about reshaping careers in the arts, and I think the offshoot of that is that new ensembles are reshaping their trajectories. so that if musicians and music students are finding new ways to be musicians, orchestras are also finding new ways to be orchestras. And to plan into the long term that maybe we're not going to end up with a $100 million budget on our own hall and subscriptions and blah, 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 but how do we actually stay relevant for 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And how do we keep renewing that mandate? And I think I'll pass it over to Chelsea and Sean to talk about that specifically.
Just really switching it up on me, hey? I think before I dive in, I should provide a little bit of context from where I'm coming from, because unlike the rest of the panel who are representing new ensembles, I'm representing a new, I guess, supporting organization in the Sistema Canada network. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Sistema movement, it's rooted in social programming that uses music as a tool for social change. And so I like how Jalem started the conversation about the different phases of life cycle and where everyone's at. So we are supporting programs who are anywhere from brand new tiny startup in small communities to larger multi-million budget organizations who are past their first decade of operations. So that's where we're coming from. And in terms of what does the first year look like for the Sistema Canada network and what does the long-term projection look like, what I love most about how the network came to be is that it has absolutely nothing to do with me. It was born of a need of the community and organically formed informally during the pandemic, when everyone realized that absolutely nobody in this world has an overabundance of resource, and that we're all a little bit sick and tired of recreating the wheel and trying to figure out things for ourselves. So that's where the network came from, is just this organic conversation, learning how to use Zoom for the first time, realizing that there's absolutely a need for a national organization to help bring together resource, help start those conversations about equity, accessibility, curriculum, and the greater orchestra ecosystem, if you will, starting from young musician training, community level, passing through other levels, and then how we connect into the bigger picture in the professional orchestras. And also how we can connect programs who have been rooted in a completely different a variety of operational models. So 3 of the Sistema programs in the country are hosted within professional orchestras. That's in Winnipeg, Calgary, and Edmonton. And we refer to that as our integrated model. And then we also have these tiny startups that are based purely on volunteerism, foundation funding, etc. And so in terms of what we're looking at the network, and the joy of sitting on this panel of everyone's so new, is that we're not locked into anything that is grandfathered in, anything traditional or old that we have to do. Instead, we get to be completely responsive to the needs of our community, and everything we do is based in the community. So that's why it was very intentionally chosen to call it the network. Not just Sistema Canada, but to include that network piece to say that everything we do is based on contributions from our membership and how we can support our membership. In my opening, I mentioned how we're here for the sole purpose of supporting, enriching, and accelerating their work. So what year 1 looks like for us is to hit a bunch of those quick wins right off the bat. Those things that say, we need this resource, we need the support, go, go, go. That's been the focus for year 1. But now, as we're looking into longer term projections, we've started up again in a unique model where we're a 3-year startup. What does Basecamp at the end of year 3 look like in this funding cycle, in those deliverables? But also, how do we set long-term goals for what the 10-year version of the Sistema Canada network looks like? How we can continue to set up models and systems that can be adaptive and responsive while also delivering immediate needs. So again, that's a little different from the worlds you're living in, but I hope that's helpful.
I guess just to give a little quick context from where I'm coming from and how I got into year 1 with the program that I do. I mean, I had no intention of starting something new or being any kind of leader or artistic director. I had done an undergrad in classical performance at UVic, trumpet, and then I sort of spent a decade freelancing in the pop and like indie rock worlds. I sort of lost my drive for orchestral performance while I was in school, which is maybe another panel. But Yeah, so I spent a decade like doing studio sessions and touring with people, and I kind of didn't see that as a sustainable thing for a lifetime. So after maybe 10 years of doing it, I was on my way out of music entirely, and I thought I would go into journalism, which is obviously not any more stable career than music, but I don't go by reason or logic, but more by intuition and what I really feel passionate about. And I was interested in storytelling, and radio documentaries is where I thought I was headed. But I applied to journalism school, and I got rejected. And out of that, like sort of in the wake of that, I kind of had the time to think, and out of that sort of, I put together these three streams of my life, which is my music experience, my own queer identity, and my interest in storytelling. And then the idea sort of just came to me that I could maybe put together a project that intersects all of those things, and that's where the Queer Songbook Orchestra came from. And in year one, I mean, the mandate of the group, even just the first show we did as an experiment, was to sort of uncover queer history and relate it to pop music and stories, you know, biographies and histories of prominent people in that realm that had been obscured because of their identity and the times they lived in and all that. But then the second stream of it was to ask the community themselves what their stories were and what they wanted to hear, or what they wanted to express themselves, and what music and what songs really meant a lot to them. So what we developed was live performances that integrate the actual stories of members of the community, along with these sort of biographical histories. But it was all in a sort of effort to have the audience feel represented and feel seen by what is happening on stage, and be invited to be a part of it, because we always invite guest narrators to be on stage with us, like telling those stories, whether they're their own or that have been written by somebody else. So it was a way of sort of really incorporating the community and having them lead us in a way of what we play. Like, we've developed shows where I have no idea what we're going to be doing, and so we just sort of put a call out for stories from people, and then the set list is decided by what we get back from the community. So that's sort of been the model in the way we work. And year one, it was a struggle, but once I had the idea, I was really pretty stubborn and determined about it. So it was hard. And in Toronto, there's a lot going on. It's hard to sort of get noticed as a new project. So the early shows were, thankfully, we booked a really small venue for the first one. So we could say we did an evening and a matinee the next day, but we could say we sold it out, but that was maybe 70 people total that were there in this little place. But there was enough there to know that we were onto something, that we should keep going. And it sort of lit a bit of a fire inside me to continue with it and see what we could do. And I'll like have big ideas and then just go for it. But so we sort of developed that, and then I didn't know how to write a grant. I'd never done that before. I didn't know any administrative skills. I worked as a decade as a side musician, and I knew how to practice the trumpet and learn my parts, and that was kind of it. So coming into this role, I know this was spoken about in the last panel, I didn't have any training from music school or anything that led me to think as an entrepreneur or think of the business side of things, taxes, HST, writing a grant, hiring someone, or being more in a leadership role. So I had to kind of like take time and really feel that out and teach myself and talk to people and just trial and error. But we did get some footing, and were able to get some larger grants and support. So by year 5, we toured across Canada. It was part of there was a Canada 150 Canada Council program, forgetting the name, but new chapter. We were able to get a new chapter funding, and we did a tour across Canada of smaller cities to kind of bring these stories and experiences to places with less visibility for queer experience. So I won't take up any more time with that, but we sort of, by year 5, I felt like we had some footing, and we could sort of, we're a little more established. People knew we were getting invites to play, festivals and that kind of thing. So, but in my experience, it just took elbow grease and, just trying to like figure it out without a lot of pre-existing knowledge of how to go about it. So I will pass it along.
Yeah, and just I'm very aware of time, and I want to make time for questions, but just something that, a theme that is so common, and something I spend a lot of time thinking about, is just what the word orchestra means. In Canada in the 21st century, is that all of us, I don't think, set out to make, I don't think budgets were a big deal, I mean, we all set out to make these ensembles to, or networks, to serve a purpose in the community, and they just happen to be what we call orchestras from a musical point. But when we talk about orchestras as the backbone of a musical community, that can be a very different thing than what we're doing. I don't think, I mean, I shouldn't speak for everyone, but I wouldn't call Symphony 21 a backbone. It is an, a foot maybe, or a hand of a general body, right? It's certainly not the main supportive structure. But we call ourselves an orchestra, and then people have preconceptions about what we do and how we run and what we should be doing. And something that Chelsea said about not anything being grandfathered in. I think, despite the difficulty of maybe being labeled a certain way because we choose to have orchestras in our names, the benefit of not having anything grandfathered in and being new is that in this time of monumental social change, we can pivot. I know everyone hates that word, but we can move into niches and cracks that are not necessarily fulfilled already. In the same way that, on a highway, a double-decker bus is a great tool if you're on an open road, but if you're in old Europe or old Nice or something, a double-decker bus isn't going to do you any good. So again, coming back to the idea of family, that all different aspects of a community are needed. And like I said, I don't think any of us started something because it was, we want to make a competitive orchestra that's going to, have our own concert hall and this and that. It all started for reasons in the community. And we just happen to be working in the orchestral medium, and that leads us down a certain path. One thing that Sean said that I'd like to build our last topic on is just how chaotic it is to start something. I know from my own experience, you build a team, but in the early days it was just me, and I remember going to the CRA page for a charity application and opening it, and very close to tears when I read through the entire 26-page, and oh my God, how do I do this? And the first time filing contracts and making venue agreements and a stage plot, and my Google Drive doesn't work, and drawings are terrible, and whatever, just the multitude of no infrastructure, no experience. But the flip side of that, and tying into like what you said, the first panel about training, is being comfortable with the chaos and understanding that it's all chaotic, and it's okay to not know what you're doing as long as at the end of the day you're serving the community. Because again, the point of this session of pushing the boundaries is not necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel, as someone said, but just like I said, as musicians are finding new ways to be musicians in the 21st century, orchestras and networks are having to find new ways to be orchestras and networks, and sometimes that means thinking outside the box and pushing the boundaries of, yes, artistic programming, but also administration, what it looks like to house your entire infrastructure on Google Drive, and what it means to have a P.O. box as an office address, and these things, and making it work, because at the end of the day, it's providing community, it's fulfilling a niche, it's building off a social mandate, and I think it's important work to be filling these gaps and to be complementary programs. Which leads me into our last topic, is just the people that you need to start something, and the difference between, I think Jana mentioned, paying everyone. and how important it is as a startup, and how tempting it is to say, we're so young and new, will you just do us a favor? And finding the time to penny pinch and times to not compromise. Maybe I'll pass it over to someone on the right side of the table to talk about this a little bit more, but I know for us, we never compromise on anything artistic. So all of our players are paid professionally, and that adds a certain place in our community. But I know for me and my admin and volunteers, essentially, I have not seen a penny from Symphony 21, which I think though you can sacrifice different parts of what you need to fulfill a social mandate. That it is an uphill battle. If these changes were easy to make, they would have been made already. And there wouldn't be a need for anyone to push any boundaries, because there would be no boundaries. So by definition, a boundary is hard to push back against, and sometimes those sacrifices are needed. But making sure that the people, the community that you're building is one out of respect and one out of, incorporating the wisdom from older organizations of how to pay people and how to treat them properly, and what it means to be a professional organization, even if your entire infrastructure is on Google Drive. Because at the end of the day, understanding that the mandate you're fulfilling and the purpose of your ensemble is not to have a large office space with lots of different apps and infrastructure tools. It's to produce concerts and to have people come and to fulfill your mandate, whether that's Allegra or Lagora or Crew Ensemble or Symphony 21 or Systema Networks, is fulfilling those mandates at all costs, which is really the point of why we're here. So I'll pass it down the line to talk about the people that you need to keep something going.
Sure thing. Thanks, Jalem. So one thing that I kind of didn't realize was one of my mental blocks was that I didn't think of my organization as contributing to the economy and contributing as an employer, when we actually are. We employ quite a few people, and through that we are actually eligible for grants and funding that is not necessarily just musical. So we were able to apply for some job training grants, and we're also an equitable employer. So since we are a targeted employer of minorities, we were able to access some funding through that those avenues. That was not necessarily just a musical grant, in addition to our arts funding, and also as an organization that does a lot of mentorship, we were also able to keep a number of our core members employed through also incorporating that into our offerings. And so it wasn't just programming funding that we were going after, it was also employment and training funding that you could also access as an organization, if that's at all helpful.
Actually, I think I'm going to bounce back to the precedent topic about sustaining what we do and thinking outside the box for funding and for making concerts possible and paying our musicians. I can just maybe talk about one example that we did recently. I think it's a matter of always, because obviously you're a small organization, we don't have means to organize like huge fundraising events and stuff like that. So I think it's a matter of like just playing with the cards you have within your organization. And for example, our conductor, he's a great athlete and runner, and I'm a runner as well. And we have musicians who likes to run, and there's a run in Montreal called the 21K run that supports every year charity organizations, but there's no cultural organization that was subscribed to that run. So last year in 2022, we just started, Nicolas and me, we just did, let's do the run, let's raise money for Orchestre de l'Agora, and we did that the first year we were 3, and now 2 weeks ago we just did it again, and we were 16 runners in our team, and we raised $30,000 for the orchestra. So it's just a small thing. It took like half a day, a Saturday morning, to just bring our board members, our volunteers, musicians, everyone, and it was just a fun thing to do, to just raise money, and we're trying to find small ideas like this that just help us raise funds and make our projects possible. So So that's how we sustain what we do. We're trying to be a bit creative about what we're doing, but yeah, I just wanted to give this small example of things that are possible and that just don't cost that much. Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure where I want to go with this one because we're sort of touching on two things. What I consider the two key factors of the resource engine behind any of our organizations, which are people and funding. And so I think those play hand in hand because they're arguably the two most important things we have to focus on, is that finding the right people, there's no replacement for that, but at the same time, we need to compensate those people. We need to make sure people's time is appropriately respected and compensated for. So I think maybe I'll touch on one thing around the money without making myself an incredibly unpopular person in this room, which is I think it's really key, especially when you're new, to spend the time to really focus in on your mission and what you do and the niche you're filling in the community, because scope creep is just so incredibly dangerous, especially when you are chasing cash. So I think it's a very dangerous step that you can take to only focus on the money and chase it and then try to bring the rest around. Okay, not too unpopular yet. Excellent, great. And then that goes hand in hand in finding really great funders who support your mission to its core, because we have to remember that yes, the funders are so incredibly important to what we do, but we're equally as important to what they do. And our missions are helping them serve their purpose and funding really important initiatives that serve community. So in finding funders that can go hand in hand, that can support your commitment to also compensating people for their time and expertise to make sure you get the right people around the table. All that being said, I've already said that we've been set up as a network, and I think the key to getting the right people around the table is also spending the time to really define roles and responsibilities and what you need from your people. Because for our members, of course, I've already said there's an expectation that our members are sharing as part of the network so that everybody's contributing in a specific way. We're not going to move into a time where every single piece of intellectual property is a transaction. That is not how a network operates. I also think that we're in a world where there's room for lots of really creative partnerships, where instead of just exchanging cash, we can work together and partner to be mutually beneficial so that we're getting the resources we need. But then likewise also to make sure there's a really appropriate amount of money there to support the voices you need at that table. And I know there's been a lot of conversation as of late about how if you cannot organically get the proper diversity at your table, should you be reaching out and just blaming it on like, oh, we can't get the right volunteers? No, we probably actually have a responsibility to find the funding to make sure we get the right voices at the table and to make sure that those voices are being appropriately compensated for the expertise they bring. So I think that goes a little bit hand in hand.
Yeah, I guess just quickly on this one, this is an interesting one for me with the QSO. We didn't really have any other staff people the first many years until we had some contract positions in 2022. So most of the administrative and stuff just sort of fell to me, and one person can only do so much. So it's tricky because there's opportunities that get missed because you can't do it all. You can't fill out all the applications or connect in all the ways that you'd be able to with more people and more resources. I'm also like a little bit on the shy side, and so in terms of being able to approach private funders and that, or like being out at the parties, or like introducing myself and really being a go-getter in that way, it's not really in my wheelhouse to be really good at that. So that's been a struggle to I think there's probably opportunities where, like, had I been more aggressively like out there, we might be able to find some more opportunities that way. So yeah, I mean, this is still an ongoing puzzle for me with finding the support and in terms of the other people on staff and the resources in terms of funding and all that. It's an ongoing mystery and puzzle and journey, I guess, with my group. So.
Yeah, and I'll just try and wrap up with one final thought because I've dramatically overshot the question and answer period. But to pick up on something that Chelsea said about chasing the money, especially for new organizations, or if you're an old organization, chasing it for new ideas. I think, I can say there was periods in the last few years that I was guilty of that, especially in the pandemic, where it's like, well, how do we do this? There's no audiences coming, so we need to go chase funding, and we'll do anything just to get that money. And, the lesson that you just said, I think every organization at some point learns that hard lesson. But one offshoot of that has really contributed to our growth is understanding that the sometimes overlooked part of it, and again, coming back to what the first panel this morning said, is the community and the audience that is actually coming to your concerts. Because I run this thought experiment that if we got $1 billion, if some angel came down and bestowed upon us as much money as we could ever want, and we could do as many concerts as we ever wanted, what would we do? And if people didn't come, is that still successful just because we have money? And the answer is always no. I mean, nobody wants to be able to pay everyone, and here's every musician gets $3,000. Congratulations, your hall is paid for, you're paid for, the administrators are paid for, no volunteers, fantastic. But if it's an empty hall, fundamentally to me, that's not a great outcome. Because the whole point of creating music and art and going through this process is to have people on the other side of the stage or in the seats. So keeping in mind that cultivating people at the admin level and the musician level is obviously incredibly important in creating a community, but the community, you also have a responsibility to be cultivating that community as audience members, especially as a new organization or network, when you're trying to attract people for the first time and saying, well, you should come to this concert because XYZ, because of this cause, because of this mandate, and thinking about that as the cornerstone. One very quick anecdote with Symphony 21 is last year when the war started in Ukraine, we pulled together a fundraiser concert in 12 days. And it was just an open call to everyone in the Vancouver Musicians Association, just come and play. We ended up with an orchestra of about 60 people. And we had a full hall and raised $28,000. But the offshoot of that is that was one of our biggest growth moments. And in looking back on that, it was more growth from that than any of our concerts, simply because we were so community-oriented in that moment. And we, were serving a very specific need at the time. And that was a huge lesson for our organization, was, continue to look for the needs that you need to serve and build your programming around that. And obviously, we realize that most people at this conference are not from startups, that were outnumbered in that sense. But I hope some of the struggles for the younger members of the orchestral family, I think can provide lessons too, in terms of what it's like in the changing landscape and how both sides of that family can support one another, and understanding that each perspective is important. Okay, we have time for like 2 questions. I apologize. There's just so much good things to talk about. So if anyone wants to ask a question to anyone on the panel or listening online, please don't be shy.
I've got a question. It's in 2 parts, and it's mostly for Chelsea and Yana because I'm most familiar with your work. But with capital O orchestras, big orchestras.
Can we get you to come to a mic, please?
So with capital O orchestras who have the words in their strategic mandate that they want to do more education and outreach and diversify their audiences and these things, Jalem, I'll just touch on what you said at the beginning when you said you get to a point where you're like, why did I even start this? Because it's important work and it gives hope for people like me. And it's, important, and it is a great example of how agile and quick to fulfill a need in the community and in how important that work is. But back to my question that's in two parts, mostly for Chelsea and Yana, just because I'm most familiar with their work and I can pick on them. With Capital Orchestra, who says that they want to add more education and outreach to their mandate, how do we, I'm speaking so broadly, and we, I mean myself, and I will take all the heat for this, how do we convince our leadership and admin of the importance of that work when we are trying to demonstrate that this needs to start at the pre-K levels, as Sean was saying? How do we demonstrate and convince leadership of the old guard who perhaps has not seen this demonstrated, that we need to invest in the youth so that they come up with the social conscience and we're able to affect the same kind of change that you are making in the smaller agile organizations on a quote unquote larger scale of like Big O Orchestra. And then Yana, when you are working with orchestras as a conductor and you're putting programs forward, what is your strategy or thought process behind educating the old guard orchestra, who my example is always Susie Conservatory, who came up, through, yes, you know exactly what I'm thinking of when I say that, right? Who like very highly valued in the environment that perhaps produce that level of quote unquote excellent music. How do we educate both sides of the fence? How do we bring those kids up to make the change, and how do we convince, for lack of a better word, the old guard of the importance of that work too? So big question. Chelsea, you go first.
So Alicia's been picking on me all morning. I already commandeered the, focus group. So I'll start sort of with a short response, and anyone who wants to continue the conversation afterwards, please feel free to come chat. I have personally been at too many tables where there are people passionately fighting for seemingly opposite points of view that are all going towards the same end goal. I think everyone's here today because we want to see the success and a state of orchestras and the entire orchestra ecosystem that's thriving in the future and that's serving our communities appropriately with proper representation, accessibility, etc. So I'd say, having also worked in the Big O Orchestra, and been on that education system side of things, I think it's really important to step away from the stance of convincing and instead seeing how you're coming in as complementing and contributing. So to really understand, especially when you're integrated and you're a subsection of a larger institution that doesn't have the same agility of someone smaller, is to be able to present what you're passionate about and what you're contributing within the bigger picture. Understand what the mission and the goals of your orchestra are and how your initiatives directly complement and contribute to that goal. Because as soon as you can plug into the bigger picture, it's so unbelievably reasonable that it's not an argument anymore. It becomes a conversation on how you're going to do it. So that would be my recommendation.
Thanks for the huge question to end the session, Alicia. So I guess when I work with orchestras or when they bring me in to guest conduct, and something that I always try to bring to the conversation is, the traditional organizations have been, bringing classical music to North America and the world for years. But as far as something that I ask them to do and to consider is, change isn't going to happen overnight, but you can have one piece on your program by a female or minority composer every time you take the stage, and not just in a trivial way, but actually reaching out to that composer, reaching out to their community, actually establishing a relationship with them. Sometimes it's a matter of emails and phone calls. You can do that. And then bringing them in whenever possible to talk about that. And also, if they're part of a minority community, that's a huge thing that, the organization can benefit from, is if that someone from within that community actually can go into that community and share what they do. And that's the start, that's the seed, because there are huge communities, being such a an internationally destination for so many immigrants that we have huge swaths of our communities that we are overlooking. And, you know, having that personal connection is, you know, of sending an email to a female or minority composer and establishing a relationship and then saying, okay, we performed your piece, now what can we do? Now what? What are the next steps? I mean, that is something that every organization can do. That is the start. There's as far as something that is always a struggle with of sometimes finding more diverse repertoire is, you know, actually being able to access those parts, and scores are they're not always easily accessible. Some I've found composers that I absolutely loved, and you know, wasn't able to program them because of you know, issues with their parts being actually published properly. So that is a bigger problem that I'm actually in conversation with folks at CMC to actually making sure that we are providing resources to some of these composers that are writing great things, but are maybe not educated in how to get their works out there and get them performed and to be actually visible. So, I mean, there's a small kind of seed of something that we can do, but then there's also the bigger picture of actually making it practical and having more minority composers actually featured in our canon of accessible works.
I see Catherine is ready to yank us off stage. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to the panelists. Please feel free to continue the conversation with any of us throughout the day, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.